please help me welcome Dr. Stuart Ablon.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here, even if I can't be there in person. I have to say, hearing applause and hearing about food trucks makes me very jealous that I am not there in North Dakota with you all right now, but I am pleased to be able to join remotely, and I want to thank the governor for inviting me again. What I hope to do is to remind folks who were with us a couple of years ago when I presented, I want to remind folks of some of the core tenets that I presented then, but also now update them in the context of the pandemic and on the heels of it, coming out of it, and talk about how we can use neuroscience, common sense, and yes, compassion on the heels of this pandemic to support students, families, ourselves. So first off, I want to remind people that one of the things that's important about our work is that it counters the conventional wisdom out there about when kids struggle. The reality is when students struggle socially, emotionally, behaviorally in our schools, too often people look at them through the lens of something that sounds like this: kids do well if they want to. And you see, if you believe kids do well if they want to, and a kid isn't doing well, well, then you're going to assume that the reason they're not doing well is because they don't want to, and you're going to set off trying to make them want to. And while that might sound very simplistic, the reality is in schools all across North America, when kids struggle behaviorally, we tend to assume that kids are behaving that way on purpose in order to get things or avoid things. And as a result, it sets in motion what looks like pretty traditional school discipline. And that is some form of sort of carrot and stick approaches, rewards, punishments, things like that. Even what's been termed positive discipline is almost entirely motivationally oriented. And what I want to do for starters this afternoon is remind people of a message that I shared a couple of years ago that flows from the awareness that conventional wisdom is almost always disproven. It almost always ends up being wrong. And so the big idea that I shared a couple of years ago is that kids who struggle at school, they don't struggle from a lack of will. What they struggle from is a lack of skill. And so the notion that kids do well if they want to should be driving our work is really inaccurate and unhelpful. And in fact, the better way to think about students is through this lens, using this philosophy. Kids do well, not if they want to, but if they can. And if a kid isn't doing well, you know what? Something must be standing in their way. Let's figure out what's standing in their way so we can help. And I'm going to remind people that we've got 50 years of research in the neurosciences that help us understand why students struggle at school if they're not doing well. But the reality is, I've yet to meet the student that prefers doing poorly to doing well. Kids do well if they can. All kids want to do well. And if they're not doing well, you can bet your bottom dollar that what they lack, what they're struggling with, is not the will to behave well, but it's the skill. And particularly, what all that research has shown is that kids who struggle to manage their behavior at school, struggle socially, emotionally, behaviorally, they struggle in areas like flexibility, frustration tolerance, problem solving. Those are the types of skills that they lack. And I could go into a lot more detail, but for now, I'm going to stay high level and just remind people that embedded in those three areas are all kinds of skills related to language and communication, attention, working memory, emotion, and self-regulation. And that word regulation, don't let it trip you up. It just means to manage or control. So your ability to control yourself, control your emotions, cognitive flexibility, how flexible you think, and social thinking skills. These are the kinds of skills that our students need on an average day to behave adaptively at school. Now, when do kids struggle with these skills? One of the most common reasons kids struggle with these skills is when they've been exposed to chronic stress or trauma in their lives, either what I call capital T or lowercase t trauma. And this is just sort of a reminder of what the impact of chronic stress is on brain development. These are two little toddlers' brains, and on the left you have a neurotypically developing toddler, and on the right you have one who's been subject to deprivation, and you see early on in life massive differences in brain development as a result of chronic stress. And yes, you guessed it, the areas, the regions of the brain that are not lighting up in this poor toddler's brain, what do those regions of the brain do for us? Help us with things like problem solving, flexibility, frustration tolerance. So this message that right now I'm just recapping from a couple of years ago, it is even more important than it was then, because we are coming out of a chronically stressful, and for some families, traumatic situation. And challenging behavior has always sort of occurred in the gap between the demands placed upon someone and the skills that we have to handle those demands. What's happened during the pandemic is that the demands were much higher. Demands to be flexible, tolerate frustration, problem solve. So just when those demands are higher and we need more skills, ironically, guess what happens to our skills when we are chronically stressed? We have a harder time accessing them. So what we've seen is kids where there was already a gap between demands and their skills, demands went up and they had less ability to access their skills. The gap is bigger. Kids who were actually behaving just fine, well, guess what? All of a sudden, the demands increased and their ability to access their skills decreased. And all of a sudden, you now have kids who weren't struggling who are struggling. And what I'm really hoping that people will be able to avoid as we look ahead in the school year is this, what I call cycle of chronic stress and trauma and punitive discipline. Because these kids who've been under chronic stress, who've been traumatized, they're coming into our classrooms with lagging skills that's leading to challenging behavior. And what we have to do is resist the temptation to meet challenging behavior with punitive discipline that only adds stress, which further gets in the way of skill development, which escalates challenging behavior. Part of the reason I was thrilled to be invited to participate is that what I think we can do with this work is we can end that cycle. Because you know what? Unfortunately, there's more stress than there was the last time I met with you all. Kids have less ability to access their skills. There's going to be more challenging behavior. And some of that challenging behavior is withdrawal, really. But this is a choice, folks. We don't have to respond to challenging behavior with punitive discipline. We can use what I call relational discipline, which has been shown to not add to stress, decrease stress, not get in the way of skill development, build skills, and reduce behavior. And the nice thing is this cycle feeds itself, because the less stress a kid is under, the more they're able to develop and demonstrate their skills, which means their behavior gets easier, which means it's easier to respond to them. So I'm guessing that the vast majority of educators in the group here are familiar with the concept of growth mindset. I'm talking about a social, emotional, and behavioral growth mindset here. Because the fact that kids who struggle with skill, not will, is actually very good news, because skills can be built. So what I want to do is I want to give you a really quick reminder and overview of an approach that I introduced a couple of years ago called collaborative problem solving. And then I want to talk about how on the heels of the pandemic, you can use that approach to literally change the stress response of your students. And interestingly, if you do that, you can change your own stress response as well. So if folks were with us a couple of years ago, if they're at all familiar with our work, you'll know that we try to keep things simple by saying to people, whatever problem you have with a student, or anybody else for that matter, you really only got 3 options for how to handle those at the end of the day. And we call those 3 options your 3 plans. We call it plan A when you try to make the kid do what you want them to do, whether you do that by enticing them with a reward or a punishment, or whether you literally try to force them to do something. And you can do that nicely or harshly, but either way, if you're doing it unilaterally, we call that plan A. We call it plan B when you try to solve a problem together with a student. And this is an important phrase, in a mutually satisfactory way. And we call it Plan C, where you decide, you know what? I'm going to drop an expectation for now. Not forever, but for now, strategically, because I've got bigger fish to fry. And we'll work on that. We're just not going to work on that yet. It's not giving in, okay? It's being smart. And what I walked folks through a couple of years ago was just this overview here of what those 3 plans accomplish and what they don't. Plan A, which is most typical response to some sort of a problem with a kid where we try to impose our will, is a way for us to try to get them to do what we want them to do. But the reality is it doesn't reduce challenging behavior. It often inflames it. It doesn't build skills. It doesn't help change the stress response of stressed kids. And it doesn't build the relationship necessary to do any of that in the first place. Now, you could decide to drop an expectation temporarily to keep things calm, but that's not working on the other goals either. And the reason we're going to focus on Plan B almost entirely the rest of the time today is when you try to collaborate with a student to solve a problem in a mutually satisfactory way, it's not foolproof, but you're trying to get your expectation met. And the way you do it will have much more chance of keeping a student calm. But perhaps most important, coming out of this pandemic, it's where you collaborate with students that you build relationship. You help them develop skills related to flexibility, frustration tolerance, problem solving. And as I'm about to share with you, you literally build the stress response, change the stress response. But we need to understand that you don't get Plan B by the average of Plan A and Plan C. Okay, you can't do a lot of A and C and hope that you're going to get B by average. The other thing you can't do is you can't always try to pull off collaborative problem solving right in the heat of the moment where a kid is escalating or shutting down. No, you want to be a detective and you want to say to yourself, you know what? I bet this kid is escalating or shutting down, having a hard time in fairly predictable circumstances, honestly. So if the circumstances are predictable, well, then we should be working on these together with them ahead of time when they're calm and accessible. Now, I hope some folks are going to remember the sort of secret ingredients that are not so secret of this thing we call Plan B, because they're pretty simple. Now, I always tell people, don't confuse simple with easy. Simple in the sense there are only three ingredients. The first ingredient we call the empathy ingredient. It's where you're asking questions, taking guesses if need be, clarifying what you're hearing by doing reflective listening, and reassuring the student that you're not trying to impose your will, you're really just trying to understand, because you know that they must be having a hard time with something, must have a good reason behind their behavior, that something's going on for them. So you work really hard as a detective to get their concern or perspective on the table. And it's only once you do that that you move to the second ingredient, where you share, this is important, not your solution to the problem. So that's going to head you right back in the direction of Plan A, but rather your concern. And the reason I'm doing this with my hands is because now you've got 2 sets of concerns on the table. And that's the way you know you're doing Plan B. If you have 2 sets of the concerns on the table, you can move to the third ingredient to invite the student to collaborate, to try to brainstorm solutions to the problem that address both sets of concerns. In fact, this is a good quick reminder, what plan are you using? If you only have 1 set of concerns on the table and it's the adults, you're headed for Plan A. 1 set and it's the child's, you're headed for Plan C. How do you know you're doing Plan B? You must have both sets of concerns on the table. Now, what our research has shown is that when you walk through these 3 ingredients with students, you not only reduce challenging behavior, you not only get your expectations met, but you build a relationship with students and you help them model and practice a whole host of skills. And these are just examples here. Embedded in those 3 basic ingredients, sort of baked in, if you will, is a ton of skills training in all those areas I talked about earlier. Language and communication, emotion and self-regulation, flexible thinking, social thinking, attention and working memory. Many educators are familiar with the term executive functioning skills. What our research has shown is when you walk through these three ingredients repeatedly with students, you help them build all kinds of executive functioning skills. And the cool thing about this is your students don't even need to sign up for skills training. All they have to be willing to do is participate in trying to solve a problem in a way that addresses their concerns too, and sort of smuggled in the back door, baked into the process, is a bunch of skills training. Now, I think we need to be honest with ourselves and remind ourselves that the bad news here is we adults, we have some lagging skills too. And I often get asked the question, how am I going to help a student build their skills if I'm struggling myself? Talk about chronic stress. I'm under chronic stress. I don't have such an easy time displaying these skills. Well, I've got some good news for you too. Every time we just practice those three ingredients with our students, we are practicing those skills as well. And it's probably my favorite research finding we have, is that when educators practice Plan B with students, it's not just the students whose brains change. The educators, we, the adults, build our neurocognitive skills as well. And that is crucial because just like dysregulation, escalation being contagious, so is regulation. And if we, the adults, develop our skills at flexibility, frustration tolerance, problem solving, we can stay calm and regulated, well, guess what? Better chance our students will as well. Now, this was my really quick reminder and overview of some of the stuff I've shared prior at the previous summit. What I want to talk about now is how you change the stress response, particularly coming out of this very stressful last year. And I want to remind people that the bad news is this thing I just described to you, Plan B, it isn't magical. It actually requires a lot of repetition. But it's in those repetitions, it's in those conversations, within this relational context, that skills are built and the stress response is changed. So, Plan B rarely ever goes ingredient 1, ingredient 2, ingredient 3, yay, done. No, the reality is you're probably going to bounce back and forth between ingredients a lot, go around and around. You'll get to a solution, it won't work. You'll have to come back, try it again. And people can get frustrated with that, but that's where you're changing the brain. Now, forgive me for a sec here as I get a little technical with you on sort of from a neurobiologic perspective, because I want to talk about a principle of neuroplasticity, which means just a sort of a rule about how you change the brain. You see, if you want to change any neural network in the brain, you have to activate that actual neural network. You can't activate a related network. You've got to activate that network. So in other words, if you want kids to develop these skills in the natural context where you want them to apply them in school, you have to activate that actual neural network. You can't sort of use hypothetical or artificial circumstances. And this is why, unfortunately, a lot of times we put kids together in groups and practice all kinds of skills. And as soon as they leave the group and have to apply the skill in real life, the skill is nowhere to be found. Social skills groups are a great example of that. The best social skills group are ones that actually create natural situations to practice skills. So one of the nice things about doing skills training through problem solving in your relationship with students is that you honor that principle. There are other advantages too. You practice a whole bunch of skills at one time. You practice those skills being integrated as opposed to standing alone, and you practice them in a relational context. Because if you need to apply these skills in a relational context in life, they've got to be practiced in that relational context. Now, here's something very crucial. And by the way, if you're interested in reading more about this piece, and particularly if you're interested in the effect of trauma on development and behavior, I'm referencing a piece that I wrote with Dr. Bruce Perry, who's a noted trauma researcher, a good friend and colleague of mine. You can find this there. But here's the essential point for the remainder of my time today. I just mentioned if you want to change a neural network, you have to activate that neural network. So if we want to change the stress response of our kids, because they have what we call a sort of tuned up stress response, especially coming out of this last year, an activated stress response. So if we want to change the stress response, we actually have to stress the kid. You can't change a network without activating the network. So you can't change the stress response without stressing the kid. So the big question is, how do you stress students safely? How do you activate that stress response safely? Now, the answer is with the right dose and pattern of stress. And, educators know more than anybody else. If you don't stress the brain, you don't learn anything. It's why if a kid doesn't feel stress at all during the course of the day, no discomfort, they're not really learning anything. However, if they experience too much discomfort, they're not learning anything either. So the right dose and pattern has to be a moderate dose of stress in a predictable and controlled way. So let's talk about how we do that, okay? Let's talk about how we use this thing that I called Plan B to provide moderate, predictable, and controlled doses of stress. Now, the first way that you make sure that this dose is moderate is by saying, all right, as I start to do this whole Plan B thing, I probably shouldn't pick the biggest problem I've ever had with this student. Maybe I should pick a sort of smaller problem, lower hanging fruit on my list of predictable issues. And then I need to be very careful about how I do Plan B so that the stress that is provided is what neurobiologists call good stress. So let's go back and reflect. I introduced these three options to you. Plan A is when you try to impose your adult will. Does that activate the stress response? Hell yeah. The problem is that it increases the power differential between us and students, which risks dysregulation. In other words, the dose is too intense to change the stress response. Now, you could default to Plan C, which decreases the power differential. You drop your expectation for now, and that won't trigger the kid. But remember, it also won't activate their stress response. And if you don't activate the stress response, you don't change the stress response. So Plan B is your way to activate the stress response, but without doing it by leveraging a power differential. Because remember, the whole idea with Plan B is you both have important concerns that need to be addressed. So Plan B is a way to achieve moderate dosing to change the stress response. And I actually find that maybe the best way to illustrate this is with images like this. So get acquainted here for a second. What this is showing is here's the dose of stress that you apply to a kid, and it's entirely dependent on the power differential. The more the power differential, the higher the stress. And you can see how Plan A, which is leveraging a power differential, so it's a big power differential there, it's a big dose of stress. Plan C is where you're dropping an expectation. There's no power differential there, and there's no stress, okay? Now, in this hypothetical example, here is a kid's stress response. And let's call this a pretty low stress response, because if somebody does Plan A, tries to impose their will upon this kid, it gets ugly. They either escalate or shut down because their ability to tolerate stress is way down here. So what do you do with Plan B? Well, you try to pick some problems that hover right around their stress tolerance level. So that means they get stressed, but not overwhelmingly so. It's not that they're not stressed at all, but it's not overwhelming. So you should see some stress. And what you do as you make your way through this process of Plan B is you'll find that slowly but surely the kid's stress tolerance level starts to increase so that problems like that were a little hard to manage before, all of a sudden get easier, to the point where Plan B that used to be really hard, you can now get through it easily. So what do you do then? Do you say, wow, awesome, I can finally do Plan B smoothly with this kid, thank goodness? Yes, you do, but then don't go on vacation with Plan B. In fact, what do? Take a harder problem to solve, one that increases the stress, because this kid's stress tolerance is higher now, and get to the point where you're feeling more stress again in Plan B. But what you'll find slowly but surely is all of a sudden, it'll get easier again. And you're solving tougher problems using Plan B. So what do you do when you're solving tougher problems? Again, you take on an even harder one. Now it's one that's going to cause some more friction, okay? And you work through those steps of Plan B, and slowly but surely what you're going to find is things that used to cause the amount of stress that Plan A causes, you're now handling effectively with Plan B. And this is really important, by the way, because people often say to me, wait a sec, this Plan B thing sounds great, but are you trying to say that you sort of need to surround kids with only educators and parents and everybody else who does Plan B? Because I hate to break it to you, but sort of a Plan A world out there. So, what's going to happen when the kid gets their first job and their boss does Plan A when they show up late for work? The boss isn't going to do Plan B and empathically try to discover why they were late for work. They're probably going to use Plan A. What happens then? Well, this is the whole point of raising the stress response. Because what eventually happens is you get to the point where you're doing Plan B over things that used to cause the level of activation as Plan A, and you're not seeing that escalation. In other words, the stress tolerance has increased to the point when, faced with Plan A, a student is able to respond adaptively. Because that's when you handle Plan A well, what are you doing? You're using your skills at flexibility, frustration tolerance, and problem solving to handle it well. So literally what we're doing here, as we're increasing the dose of stress by taking on harder problems to solve, is we are changing the stress response. We are building stress tolerance. So that is how you make things moderate. How do you make them predictable? Well, particularly kids with trauma histories, unpredictability is very dysregulating. It's actually how you develop a sensitized stress response, because you never know exactly when something's coming your way that could be dangerous. So what does that mean? You're hypervigilantly always on the lookout. The antidote to that is having exposure to stress be predictable. How do you do that? By following the same 3 ingredients that I talked about before in the same order. Because here's the interesting thing. The first ingredient is regulating. Empathy is regulating. In fact, I would argue it's the greatest human regulator we have. But once you've regulated a student, sharing your concern is going to be dysregulating. I have never, ever seen an educator use Plan B, get to the second ingredient, and not see some uptick in dysregulation from a student. And by the way, when I say uptick in dysregulation, sometimes that's escalation. Sometimes it's a kid dissociating and shutting down, looking like they went elsewhere, or just spitting out whatever they thought you wanted them to say. Something we call dissociative compliance. So the first ingredient's regulating. The second is dysregulating, because most students have learned that when there are 2 sets of concerns on the table and one's the adults, it's going to trump theirs. So the first is regulating, second's dysregulating, but the third is regulating again. Because being asked to collaborate on coming up with solutions that address your concerns as well, that's calming. So it's the same thing that I was talking about before when you're looking to hover right around a kid's stress tolerance level. You do the first ingredient, the empathy ingredient, it's going to be calming. There's not a big dose of stress. But when you share your concern, you'll see an increased dose of stress. And it's okay. You want to see a kid get a little stressed, not too stressed. But as you go to invite them to solve the problem in a way that addresses their concern as well, it's actually going to re-regulate them. And if you continue taking on tougher problems, what's going to happen is each time you get to that second ingredient, you're going to bump up against their stress tolerance level. But you'll see that building over time. So, moderate dose by picking a smaller problem at first, but then moving up as you go. Predictable by using the same 3 ingredients that regulate, then dysregulate, then regulate. And by the way, when I say predictable, kids start to learn these ingredients. I mean, if I had more time, I'd show you a video of a student where the educator gets the kid's concern on the table, starts to share her concern, and the kid says to her, "Can we just go ahead and solve the problem now?" Because he knows what the cadence of those 3 ingredients are. And predictability and control, so important to traumatized kids. Speaking of control, one of the things you need to do is you need to have a control valve, if you will, so that if things get too hot, you can re-regulate. And this is embedded in those 3 ingredients as well. Now, I mentioned to you my colleague, Dr. Bruce Perry, and if anybody is familiar with his work, which is getting a lot more notice these days thanks to his most recent book that he just co-authored with somebody most people know, whose name is Oprah Winfrey. And in that book, he tries to distill some of these thoughts in a way that can be introduced to the lay public. And I think one of the most helpful concepts is these 3 R's that he talks about: regulate, relate, reason. And what he argues is that you can't reason with a person. So let's talk about students. You can't access a student's prefrontal cortex, the smart part of their brain up here, if they're dysregulated. See, because we humans process information from the bottom up, not the top down. Information doesn't hit the smart part of our brain first. It hits this part, low down the brain first. Now, if we're regulated, information can move up the brain. And if we feel like we're relating to somebody, then and only then can we really access our cortex in an interaction. So you've got to remember this process: regulate, relate, reason, which really honors the neurobiologic sequence with which our brains process information. Now, people tend to love that concept: regulate, relate, reason. You can't reason with somebody who's dysregulated. They get it. But how do you do it? Well, you already know how to do it if you follow these ingredients, because the first ingredient of Plan B is where you empathize. That's where you regulate a student. And it's only once a student is regulated and is filling you in about their concern that you're able to then go up and the brain and say, let me now share my concern with you, which is going from regulating to relating. And if you've got those 2 sets of concerns on the table, you've regulated them, you're relating to them, then and only then do you go to the 3rd ingredient and ask them to collaborate, which is in essence your invitation to talk to their cortex. Now, what I think is so helpful about this is if at any point in this process, a kid goes brainstem on you and gets dysregulated, all you do is you go right back to the beginning of Plan B. Whether you were here, you shared your concern and they thought you were going to impose your will and they get upset, you go right back to the first ingredient. Or maybe you're trying to come up with solutions and they get upset, dysregulated, shut down. You just go right back to that first ingredient. Regulate, relate, reason. Empathize, share your concern, collaborate. So those 3 ingredients will help you stay true to how our brains process information. And so I showed you this nice looking thing that happened before where you regulate, you relate, it causes a little bit of stress, but then you ask them to collaborate with you and now you're using reason and it's all worked okay because you haven't exceeded their stress tolerance level. Well, anybody who's ever tried this knows that that's not always the case. And oftentimes what happens is you do a great job of regulating and understanding a student's concern and you share your concern and unbeknownst to you, it exceeds the kid's stress tolerance level and they get dysregulated. What you do then is don't proceed. Don't move on to the 3rd ingredient and ask to reason with somebody who's dysregulated. What you got to do is go back here and re-regulate. Now, I'm throwing a lot at you here, but basically what I'm describing is a recipe. It's a recipe for following how our brains process information, for respecting where a kid's stress tolerance level is, and for making sure the dose of stress is moderate, predictable, and controlled, because that's how you change the stress response. Kids who have a sensitized stress response, their dose of stress up to now has not been moderate. It's been severe. It has not been predictable. It's been unpredictable. And it hasn't been under their control in any way. So if you're going to change that stress response, you've got to activate it, but activate it in a moderate, predictable, and controlled way. Now, having said all this, Plan B in the real world is hard because just the first ingredient itself, the empathy ingredient, can be really dysregulating for traumatized kids. And the reason is basically in the empathy ingredient, you're trying to achieve a certain amount of what you might call relational intimacy. You're trying to get close to a kid. You're trying to say, let me in. Help me understand what's hard for you. Help me understand your perspective, your point of view. So the point is that Plan B itself can actually be triggering, especially when you cross what Dr. Perry calls this invisible intimacy barrier. And you don't know, it's invisible. You don't know where it is. You might cross it without permission at any point. But what I'm hoping to describe to you today is if you do cross it, you know how to back out of it. The way you back out of it is returning to that first ingredient of Plan B. So it's a challenge, but the opportunity is that this roadmap, those three ingredients, can literally help you learn how to negotiate that intimacy barrier with students. Now, there is a lot of talk about our schools being trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive. And there's a lot of good training that occurs these days to teach schools those principles. I have to say one of the things that frustrates me is many schools have had trauma-sensitive training, declare that they are, quote, trained, even though I don't know how you are ever officially fully trained. It's not a destination. But a lot of schools check the box of we've been trained, and yet I see things like school discipline being used in a way that violates those very principles. So it's one thing to sort of talk the talk, but it's another to walk the walk. And this is why I think if you practice collaborative problem solving, what you're doing is you're making those principles that we can all agree upon, you're making them actionable, okay? Because, for instance, we know that you shouldn't be using power and control to try to change a kid's behavior. And yet, behavior contracts, point and level systems, token economies with little kid sticker charts, those are using power and control to try to manipulate kids' behavior. If you are using collaborative problem solving, you're trying to back away from Plan A that can be re-traumatizing. And instead, you're trying to use this thing called Plan B, which reduces the power differential. And I just want to be clear, when I say reduces the power differential, we adults, educators, you haven't lost any power. You still are going to aggressively pursue your concerns and make sure they get addressed. It's just that the kids' concerns are equally important. And it's when you feel powerless in the midst of a power differential, that's what triggers dysregulation. And again, especially for traumatized kids who unfortunately have had power differentials used against them. So this is how you decrease dysregulation, by reducing the power differential. Now, a lot of people think that trauma work, doing trauma work, means going back and sort of revisiting traumas that have occurred. We now know, folks, that can actually be re-traumatizing, do damage, do developmental damage, because it literally strengthens the associations in the brain. What we now know about doing trauma work is the best way to do trauma work is to safely detoxify triggering situations because of past traumas. So adults in schools, we're authority figures. And you know what? Authority figures, where there's a power differential, are going to trigger kids with trauma histories. But you can use this process to build a relationship and help kids develop skills they need to handle those situations without being triggered, while making sure their concerns get addressed. And ultimately, as I hope I've illustrated, you can use the process to literally change the kid's stress response. And that, folks, that is making trauma-sensitive education actionable, building relationships, helping kids develop skills arrested as a result of trauma, and changing the stress response. Now, I want to make sure to leave some time for some questions or discussion here. Before I turn it back here, I just want to point out where folks can get a little bit more information if you'd like to learn more. Our program is Think Kids, which is here at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. You can go right to our website, thinkkids.org, where there's all kinds of resources, training opportunities for schools that want to partner to implement the model deeply, all kinds of resources there for families, parent classes, all kinds of things that people can access there. If you are a reader, there's an array of different books. In schools, our curriculum is called the School Discipline Fix, but I also encourage parents and others to consider Changeable, which helps bring these ideas to every one of our relationships. Because the reality is that when somebody's behaving poorly, not just kids, all these ideas apply. It's about skill, not will. And you can use these same tenets, this same process in your relationships with your spouse, partner, relative, colleague, supervisee, co-teacher, you name it. Please, I hope if you're interested in this work, you will seek us out not only on the web, but on social media and stay connected with us. If you are looking to get in touch with me as well, you can go directly to my website, or you can catch me on Twitter as well. I guess the last thing I will say to conclude my remarks here is that I'd return us to the philosophy behind this work, which is students do well if they can. As I mentioned at the outset, I've yet to meet the student who prefers doing poorly to doing well. And you know what? It's been a rough year. Students are going to want to do well more than ever, and yet they may struggle to do well. And those struggles may take very different forms than pre-pandemic. But as you try to embrace this mindset, students do well if they can. It's about skill, not will. As you try to practice this process of empathizing before sharing your concern and then inviting students to collaborate, just know it's hard. And when it's hard, please remember that it's not just students do well if they can, folks. It's educators do well if they can too. Just like parents do well if they can. The reality is we are all doing the best we can to handle what the world is throwing at us, and it's thrown a lot at us, with the skills that we have to handle those things. And if somebody's struggling, there's a mismatch between what the world is throwing at somebody and the skills they have to bring to bear. Don't seek power and control in those instances. Seek empathy. Empathy is the biggest, most powerful human regulator we have. And if you can regulate each other through empathy, co-regulation will occur. See, I've talked to you a lot this afternoon about words you can use and things like that. The reality is that the part of our brain that processes language, it's the same part of our brain that regulates everything from our heart rate to our blood pressure, our entire nervous system, which means in many ways, we are sort of caretakers of each other's nervous systems. And we can use our words to dysregulate or harm, or we can use our words to regulate, to understand. And if you want a student to understand your perspective or point of view, there's no better way to make sure that's going to happen than start by understanding theirs first. Regulate before relate, and then reason. And most of all, remember, people do well if they can. So thank you very much for having me.